So going back to, so you started out in the 70s and the 80s, and
that kind of like dates me, Reagan.
Well, I mean, that's cool. That's actually cool today, right? Because that's
True.
just the music that's in today.
True.
Which, brings up the question: was music better in the 70s and the 80s, or was it written better? Maybe we have more advanced production that we can do, but even that, people feel like there's a certain charm to music in the 70s and the 80s, or maybe it was just written better, maybe more complex, whereas today people kind of just seem to be reusing the same stuff, at least with pop music. So I don't know, what's your opinion on music back then versus today?
It's kind of a loaded question because when I go back to my memories of when I first really heavily got into music with a lot of the classic rock of the era, the 60s, the 70s stuff, I think each era looks back at the previous as better and the era they're currently in as not adequate. And then as time goes on, you look back at the era that you thought was somewhat adequate, For instance, I look back at the 70s and 80s, and, I was not exactly into disco as a person playing in a rock band, So it was, an era that was disheartening because they took the limelight from a lot of the developing rock acts that were happening in the 70s. And they also changed the direction of music. But a lot of rock bands then conformed to that. The Stones did Some Girls, which was, kind of dancey, kind of incorporated some of the modern sounds. And I think it's healthy, though, for music to kind of morph and migrate. But even like in 1967, Jimi Hendrix did All Alone at Watchtower, which was a redo of Bob Dylan's song.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key in redoing any song, especially as a producer, would be to do it your way. Sure, take the elements that made the song a hit and introduce your concept in it. So if you listen to Bob Dylan's version versus Jimi Hendrix's version, they both own their versions clearly, There are some acts that just ride the wave of, well, we know for sure this is going to be a hit because it was a hit, and they're kind of riding that wave more and don't really put a lot of unique push into it, So, it's a loaded question because we always think that. I thought that the 90s was rather stagnant, but now as you look back, you see that there were some pretty, important bands that changed the direction of rock and dance and pop. And, you have dance that's gone through a tremendous amount of evolution, has changed. And it's funny how it makes a full circle. Because now we're kind of back to disco, really.
Right.
When you're talking about 80s, you're talking about really disco. And, although people don't like to call it that.
No, they have other terms for it.
Yeah,
synth pop or
correct,
synthwave.
Because it's not cool, I guess, I don't know.
There's new disco. It's called new disco, NU disco. It can't even spell the full word new.
Interesting.
It's that new.
Is it like KNEW? Or?
No, not that kind.
Yeah, it's like there's Euro pop, and it's what it really is. The bottom line is you can label it anything. It's a melting pot. It's a combination of people's experience, and what's old is new. What people have not heard is new to them.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes,
which is why you had records come back in, and even tape cassettes. There's some people using.
Absolutely,
I've seen bands release their latest album on a tape cassette, and there's certain limited amount. They always sell out because it's like a limited number, and it's a
funny thing. I have a friend who owns a drum shop, and I went to his drum shop to visit him. He's like, "Hey, I just have a lesson. Could you just watch the front for a minute?" I go, "Sure." And this person walked in. He was a young kid, maybe 20, and he said, "Hey, I'm looking for this adapter," and he was showing me an RCA cord, and he needed a Y cord or something. I go, "Oh, sure." So, excuse me, but what are you doing with that? Because usually that's analog equipment, unbalanced, high impedance. And he's like, "Oh, we're recording on a Fostex 8-track." I go, "You mean the cassette Fostex, like Porta Studio back in the 80s?" He's like, "Yeah, it's the hottest thing." I mean, well, do you think the quality is good? Yeah, but that's what we're after. See, so people want to be unique. They want something no one else has, or at least hasn't heard, to say, "Hey, that's so bad, it's good." You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's okay. That's okay. That's with everything from hairstyles to wearing different color socks to, you know what I mean? Platform shoes. And I mean, there's so many different evolutions of style and stuff like that. But, I thought that the 60s and even into the 70s was inspired by the culture of things, the
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate situations with the Vietnam War, and you had a lot of those protest bands with Woodstock and so on and so forth. So that when Desert Storm came and when this whole invasion with Iraq came, very unfortunate and something I was not very happy about. The one positive I thought would be what it would do culturally with music.
Hmm.
And I was surprised it kind of stalled. It didn't really create this incredible new wave of new music and new feel, and it just
I wonder if because maybe it didn't impact people's everyday lives as much as like the Vietnam War did.
that's an excellent point. That very well could be, but it's hard when the news is dominated by it,
Mm-hmm.
and when everything you talk about when somebody comes in the studio is dominated by it,
Mm-hmm.
and there's strong opinions, even today. Politics, we're all American, and there's a lot of people that can't talk about politics.
Oh yeah.
They get very, very upset, and I can't quite understand that. Like, but why? Why can't we talk?
Can't disagree anymore.
You can't, and
Without being hateful, right? So.
Yeah, it's just so it doesn't. I don't know. It's but even at that, you would not create some form of music, even if it's anger based.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's music is interesting, and the times are interesting, and how culture changes is interesting. I mean, the advent of bell bottoms was a couple of years ago, where people were coming back with that, and it was unheard of if you wore that. So, I tell people, there's no such thing as an outdated song. It's either too early or too late. It's as simple as that, really.
Yeah, there's definitely a nostalgia factor. That's what like the synthwave genre is definitely a big part of it is
absolutely
nostalgia influence. So if someone did want to create music that sounded like it came from the 70s or the 80s, there's probably a better way than buying expensive equipment that came from the actual 80s, like that tape machine you mentioned.
Yeah.
So what are some maybe software or what are some processes that people can go through to make their music sound more like it came from the 70s or the 80s?
So again, I wish I had silver bullet answers. The problem is really,
well, no, that's what I appreciate, because it's definitely a nuanced question.
Yeah. The problem is really understanding the texture of sound from that era. So when you sit back and think about it, the texture of the recordings of the 20s, the swing era, the 40s, the 50s, when Elvis came and introduced rock and roll, what does that sound like out of your stereo? And then when the 60s came and the Beatles exploring all different and the advent and the redevelopment of equipment, what made that sound different than Elvis's stuff? And then the 70s, when people were really exploring, machines were becoming much, much more dynamic in range. Groups like Led Zeppelin, the drum sounds there, and even in the 80s, we have disco, the bass that was never ever obtained. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Now is this tremendous amount of bass. And then we can keep talking about it as we go into the 90s. And then we have that, the merging of Run DMC with Aerosmith and this whole melting of different styles. And it's like the music is also indicative of what technically can happen. So now to answer your question more focused, how can you kind of get a 70s, 80s texture? First, you've got to understand how those sounds sounded. So it doesn't even matter genre-wise, was it, pop? Was it the Cars, or was it something more synth dance-based? Or was it disco using synths, What was the overall commonality in there, And you'll notice that it's diminished dynamic range, meaning bass to treble, and also an overall smokiness to it that was like, I guess can be compared to 5K video versus film. What Quentin Tarantino's doing, using digital filters to make it look analog, from scratches in film to the blurriness of it. There's a certain something about that that you can connect with, even though it doesn't seem as real as some of the real crisp 5K stuff.
Right.
It's more natural to you. You know what I mean? Because I don't know the way our optics work. I don't know, but it's the same thing audio wise. There's a certain dynamic range that's just indicative of the era. So what you need to do is understand that and then work within that parameter. Now, a lot of people be like, well, is it just that dynamic range? No, because the equipment created a texture. Tape created a texture that digital does not do. which is why we see the advent of a lot of these emulators, these tape emulators.
Right.
We see a big wave nowadays in 2022 of saturation modules. What they are recreations of experiences we had as engineers with analog equipment and their limitations. Distorting tape was something that an engineer like Eddie or Kramer capitalized on. That was his signature. Work it to the edge. Not to the point it's horrible, but just so it's edgy. And, even like the Beastie Boys, they cut their signature record on Radio Shack microphones, purposely distorting the preamps in those mics for the texture of that.
Interesting.
I was working on a Fat Boys record in the late 80s. Same exact thing. They were overdriving the preamps at the console for a unique sound. So understanding how things are worked in an orthodox way and then breaking those rules is art. It's not a problem. Who's to tell Picasso, hey, that head's on backwards? Can't do that. You know what I mean? Can't do that.
That's debatable.
True. See, to each his own.
Hey, if you got value from this video, feel free to drop a like. If you're looking for a proven step-by-step process for consistently producing pro quality music from home, then just grab my free rapid song finishing checklist in the description below. Also, if you're just looking for more tips and tutorials on how to produce pro level music from home, then just check out my playlist or video on the screen right now. All right, have an awesome day and keep creating.